Hey, Jen.
Hey, Jen. Hey, Kristin.
Hi. Hi, Kristen.
Jen number two. Hey. Whoop. I can't hear you yet. Let's see.
There. Hi.
Hey.
I'm getting feedback. There. Can you hear me okay?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Okay, good. Yes. Sorry, I
Good.
just came from a soccer game, so it went long. I was like, I
I
gotta
gotta get there. No worries. No worries.
Oh, look at you. Wait, is that your office?
Yeah, it is. Yep. It's well the one wall of my office that isn't filled with boxes piled sky high and towering stacks of books.
Oh, that looks so pretty and so
Oh,
awesome.
thank you. Thank
Very
you.
nice. I know I keep saying, I'm like, I need to make a special place for my for
Oh my gosh, I do this so many nights a week that it's like I just had to do something to find some kind of background.
totally. Do you think I mean chatting before we even start, but I know you said you just came off touring, but do you think that kind of this Zoom thing will stay post COVID? I hope so.
I think it will. I think it's going to be a hybrid going forward. My opinion is I think we're going to go through like a dip in the Zoom attendance as the world reopens, and then I think people are going to find their way back to it because I think it's just connected us in a way that it hasn't before and allowed us, to connect with people we might not have been able to connect with
Totally.
prior to
Yeah,
this.
and
So
I think
yeah.
I would think for you as an author, well, I mean, I know you wear two hats, but for you as the author, it's so much easier, right, than having to
Yeah.
literally go bookstore to bookstore and you can in theory touch a lot more people without leaving
You
your
know,
office.
it's a nice combination. I just came
Right.
off of eight solid days on the road, and it was worth every second. Like I'm exhausted, I am depleted. I missed my family terribly, but like there was just something about getting back out there in person and really doing it, you know? So I think it's nice to have a combination of the two.
Yeah, it's invigorating. I just got back from my national sales meeting, which we hadn't had in 2 years, and
Oh,
it was like 200 people, and for 4 days, and we were in Dallas, and I was like,
oh,
in a way, it's weird, but in a way, we acted like it was back to normal, and I don't know. So it's
yes. I know. I absolutely. It is a weird feeling though, right? Like you get so
yeah,
used to, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
just not even having a mask on, and then like flying again with a mask, and then I don't know.
It's
It's
all
weird.
it just trying to to navigate each new place you land and like what the feelings are there about, you know what I mean? It's just, all of it's weird.
Yeah,
Everything's
for
weird right
sure,
now.
for
Yeah.
sure, for sure. All right. Well, I think it is 8 o'clock. So we always like to start promptly so that because your time is so precious. So, and I think I already saw it's recording. And I think anybody that's joining is now going to be muted as they join in. So, we mute all the members, and then they can, if they have questions, they'll put them in the chat, and then I'll watch the chat. But we also ask for questions in advance. So, sorry, I just saw your email. This is a Q&A.
Okay.
So,
I'm like, I'm ready to go either way. No
yeah.
problem.
So, welcome to the Peloton Moms Book Club. We
Thank
are
you.
so thrilled to have you Zooming with us tonight. And I always like to thank Lindsay, who is one of our members who shares her Zoom account with us. So, thank you to Lindsay.
Oh, thank
And
you.
then my cohort, Jennifer. So, she does so much to help promote the events and our giveaways and running the Instagram. So, big thank you to her. And thanks to all the moms who funneled me with their questions in advance. And then
Great.
please feel free to add them in your comments as we go along. So let's get started. The first question I have for you is centered around how you decided to write historical fiction. It seems to me that it would require so much research. So do you have a background in history? Were you a history major? What is your ties to historical fiction?
So that's a great question. And I started off writing something totally different than this. I started off writing chick lit. I started off writing romantic
Oh,
comedy. Yeah, I wrote my first, so I'm 42 now. I wrote my first book when I was 23 or 24. It came out when I was 26, and that was back in the mid 2000s when chick lit was all the rage. You know, it was the Nanny Diaries and Bridget Jones's Diary and Sex in the City and kind of all of those things. So it was very much in line with what people were doing at the time, and also in line with where I was at, you know, in my mid 20s. So I did that for a little while. I wrote 6 books in that basic genre, but it just never felt like me. I enjoyed it. I am proud of those books, but I knew that wasn't where I fit. You know what I mean? Um, I had always been drawn to World War II. One of my favorite books growing up, probably my favorite book growing up, was The Diary of Anne Frank. That was a book that just profoundly moved me, profoundly changed me. Um, and yeah, so you know, the first short story I ever wrote was about a girl in a concentration camp, and that was when I was, or the first short story I ever wrote and submitted anywhere. That was when I was about 13, 12 or 13. So like clearly this has been an interest of mine for a long time. And then I wrote The Sweetness of Forgetting, which was my 2012 novel, which involved World War II. And once I started, I couldn't stop. I mean, it just, there are so many fascinating stories that haven't been told yet, or that we don't know very well. We only know the tip of the iceberg of the story, right? Um, and these are stories that connect so much with our own pasts, but also with finding a way forward, and they're still so relevant. But you asked specifically about my background. I don't have a background in history. I have a background in journalism, which I think has taught me to dig deep and to be able to ask people questions too. And writing about a historical period where there are still survivors alive today, having the ability to ask questions and dig with the skills of a journalist, I think has really served me well.
Fascinating. Love that.
Yeah.
I didn't know about the chicklet. So now I may have at the end, maybe I'll have you share maybe your favorite that you recommend from your chicklet days.
Honestly, none. None.
Oh, come on now. I mean, just on the side, the book I loved this book, but it's taking me everything not to ask a few questions about the Book of Lost Names, because
We can talk about that too. That's
I
fine.
absolutely loved that book. I mean, I really liked this one, but I don't know, I just adored the Book of Lost Names. So
thank you so much.
Okay, so when you sat down to write The Forest and the Stars, how had you discovered the tales about the old women who lived deep in the heart of the forest? Had you heard those, or were you more geared towards kind of the true groups that lived in the forest, and then she developed out of that?
Yes, the latter. So so the 2 women at the heart of this story, Yona, who is kidnapped from her German parents and raised deep in the heart of the wilderness, and Yerusha, who's the woman who kidnaps her, who brings her into the depths of this forest and teaches her all these survival skills. Those 2 women are fictional, and those are just from my imagination. But the story is very much grounded in reality because, like you said, it's based on the real life survivors, the real life refugees who actually did flee their villages and flee the ghettos and moved into the forests of Eastern Europe and survived the war that way. So the first time I heard those stories, I was in awe because it's so hard to wrap your mind around that you could flee to a forest,
Right.
and live for years. Like, I don't need it, it's so hard to even understand, but these forests that they lived in were vast, they were dark, they were inhospitable, and if you didn't know them, it was dangerous to go into them. So for the Germans, particularly the forest where most of this book was set, the heart of the forest is very swampy and um, very dark and very confusing and very, like, you would have to know your way around the forest. Or if you were a German, a group of German soldiers moving into the forest, you would be very much at risk of being ambushed because you couldn't bring your vehicles. You would have to walk for days to get to the center of the forest, and along the way you'd be very vulnerable. So that was fascinating, just the real life way that people survived, and why these forests were able to protect them was really fascinating to me.
Yeah, the survival. I have so many questions about that, so I don't want to go out of order. I tried to put everything in order and organize it, so I don't want to skip ahead because I think this is more pertinent. So, was it difficult to present both the Nazi point of view as well as the everyone trying to escape into the forest, and then to that end, was it, it's sometimes it's really hard, I think, to, it's so emotional to read some of your words, particularly the scene. It was so striking to me of the nuns. And, I'm assuming everybody's read the book, so I try not to give away too much, but the scene with the nuns at that, I had to take a pause. I was like the visual of that. I was like, so I can't even imagine, as you as a writer, like how that can't be easy to write, right? Like you had to have been not
Yeah.
wanting that fate for the nuns, but
Oh,
it was
right.
obviously inevitable, I guess.
Well, the nuns were based very loosely, much more loosely than the refugee groups, very loosely on a real life group of nuns who, I don't want to give away too many spoilers either, but you know what, it's mentioned in the author's note. So if you read the book, the author's note tells you the real story of those nuns, but it really was nuns who made, how can I put this without, I'm just trying not to give any spoilers, who did something enormously heroic in the face of great danger and great evil. And Yeah, they're an incredible, but you're absolutely right. Because of the real story, their story could not have ended any other way than it did. And
Yeah.
that was difficult to write. I mean, it's always difficult to write when you're writing about things that are so dark and filled with so much despair and so much complete lack for humanity. You know what I mean? Like the
Hmm.
lack of humanity. So these, some of these things that were happening, it's almost unimaginable that they were happening. But then how do we imagine, how can we wrap our heads around the fact that 6 million Jews perished in the Holocaust either? You know what I mean? Like that is it, that
Yeah.
is a fact that, although I know that number, like it blows my mind every time, because the scope of that is unimaginable. So to tell these smaller stories that fit within that, it's heart-wrenching, it's searing. And that is because the reality was so much more horrible than what we could capture on the page, I feel like,
Yes. Yeah. I thought you did an amazing job having the, well, faith is a whole nother topic that I want to talk about, but as
Sure.
it relates specifically to the nuns, um, I don't know, like at one point, I, I could feel that they were at peace, because of their faith, and the fact that you conveyed that through the written word, and it was really, really incredible piece of writing. That particular
Thank you.
section to me was
Thank you.
astounding. So, because faith is obviously, I think, sometimes a really difficult thing to have come through the page,
Yeah.
without, and you presented lots of different faiths in the book, and so, that was really interesting to me too, because it wasn't slanted one way or the other, and,
Thank you.
so all of that. So we'll get back to faith in a second, but, the survival skills needed to live in the forest that Jerusa had the foresight to teach Yona, um, led me as a reader to assume she was a bit of a visionary.
Yeah.
Is that kind of what your idea of Jerusa was as well?
That's a
Is
great
that
question.
how you
I lean
describe
I
her?
I lean in that direction, but I honestly can't give you a full answer on that, because I don't know. Yerusha believes that she's a visionary who knows things about the future and who's following this pre-written plan, she's following this destiny that only she seems to know, and she's following, what she feels like she's been called to do. But at the same time, it's a little crazy to kidnap a child from the safety of her home.
Right.
It's a little crazy to raise her in complete isolation and fill her head with all these things about how, venturing outside of the forest will kill her. So I don't know. Yerusha was a character who kind of came to me very fully formed, and I'm not sure I entirely know Yerusha. I think there are some things that happen in the book that make me think that perhaps Yerusha had some sort of foresight, but how much foresight she had, coupled with the decisions she made on her own, you know what I mean? Like, which really, in a way, is kind of at the heart of so much of the novel. Identity. What makes us who we are? Are we born to be who we are? Do we choose to be who we are? Are there voices from the forest leading us to who we are? Are there people
Right.
who kidnap us? So it's all those little things that are like the cocktail of you, right? Like the cocktail of what makes you who you are. And I think Urusha is more complicated than most. I don't know.
So that's follow up to that then is, in your eyes, is she good or is she bad or somewhere in between? And did she save Yona or did she steal her?
I think those are the big questions, and I'd be interested to hear what you think, having read it. But in my mind, she probably is somewhere in between. I think that she feels like she's doing something that she has no choice but to do, but she doesn't really raise Yona with love. I mean, she takes her away from a
Yeah.
place that, for all its faults, and certainly we know there are faults, maybe she would have been loved there. You know what I mean? And maybe would that have been a better life for her? Would that have been a better fate for her? Maybe, or maybe not. Maybe she was meant to make her way into the woods. Maybe she was meant to do the things that she did. Maybe Urusha did do this selfless thing by giving her, this whole different opportunity than the life she was born into. Um, but I mean, hindsight's 2020 too, right? Like you can't look at you can't look at that as it's happening and say like, yeah, Urusha, you should be kidnapping a 2-year-old from her safe, warm bed, right?
Yeah.
um, so those are things that I would like for you to think about as you're reading the book. I would like for you to ask yourself what you think. Whether you think Urusha saved her or condemned her, whether Urusha helped her or hurt her. Whether it came from a good place or whether it came from a selfish place, and I think there's a blend of all of those. I think Urusha's complex and Yona's complex, and those are at the heart of the complexities.
Yeah. Fascinating. So after, I don't think we're giving too much away here, but after she passes, so Yona is left, obviously, I think,
Yeah,
searching for her true identity, feeling torn between knowing that she had a family and she was taken from it, which is
yeah,
interesting in and of itself that she told
yeah,
her that. Um, and then she's torn between, it seems to me, religion, culture, society versus isolation.
yeah,
So um, you kind of just touched upon that, but I think it opens up the discussion of is our identity truly predetermined, or are we able to kind of recreate ourselves based on how we
yeah,
choose to live our life? And I guess it wasn't really her choice.
yeah,
But she, I think, is a different person because of how she was raised, ultimately was raised, than if she had stayed with her parents. Even just, I think you know, I think you intimated that, they've come up from a position of, a little bit of wealth and they're comfortable, if you will. So,
her parents, yeah,
would
yeah,
she have become the person she became if she didn't have to struggle and,
yeah.
survive? And so, I guess that's, were you setting out to ask those questions, or have the reader be asking those questions, or do you think that just was a result of the story you told?
um I didn't set out with those questions at the beginning. I rarely do. When I start a book, I think I set out with the basic premise. So, what is the historical story I'm going to tell? And then, as I'm beginning to research the historical story, the historical backdrop, the characters begin to develop. And as the characters begin to develop, the story begins to develop. And then the story develops. And as the story is developing, I think I begin to realize what internal story I'm telling, right? Like this
Mm,
one is a story of identity. This
mm,
book is a story about what makes us who we are. And are we a product of what runs through our blood, or are we a product of how we were raised, or are we a product of the decisions we make in life, or is it some combination of those? Do you know what I mean? So
mhm.
um so I didn't set out to explore that, but as soon as I had a vision for who Yona was and how her life began and how she moved through that life into a different place than either her birth or her kidnapping had intended her to move into,
Yeah.
I think those questions of identity really began to echo. And I think when I'm writing and those questions kind of keep nagging at me, nagging at the plot, nagging at the protagonist, I think they begin to get bigger and reach their fingers into other areas of the novel too.
Mm.
And then I think it's in the editing process that you kind of hone in on those questions and you realize, okay, I have been asking this question all along. How can I ask it more powerfully? What other threads can I sew into this that underscore that question? Um, but I think that for me, this was sort of a personal journey. The asking these questions about identity, because I was raised Catholic. My mom's side of the family is Catholic. They're Irish. That's what I've always thought of myself as, Irish Catholic. But my dad's side of the family is Jewish, and that's a side of my family I didn't know that much about when I was younger. It's a side of my family I've spent the last 20 years learning more about, and learning about my background, and learning about the culture, um, and learning about where I came from, and what 3/8 of my blood comes from, right? So I think that's a journey I've been on for 20 years. Um, Thinking to myself, okay, I had this idea that I was defined by this one cultural background and this one religious background, but that's only a piece of me. And so now that I know that there are these other pieces, how does that change me? Does it change who I am at my core? Does it change what I'm responsible for? Does it change how I walk forward in this world? Does it change the stories I tell? Or have those things always been within me and I just didn't know? You know what I mean? I just didn't know that was my calling. I just didn't know that was my path. And so those are very complicated questions, I feel like. So that journey of identity is one that I've been on. And I think that sometimes I think when you write a book, you don't know what question you're asking yourself until you start to answer it. And I think that this book was a little bit of that for me. It was asking questions of identity that I have.
Well, maybe that explains why I think you can so comfortably convey faith
Yeah.
in multiple religions, and maybe that's
Yeah.
some of your research and your self-searching that you've been doing for the last 20 years, and maybe that's how it comes through
Yeah.
so authentic and real.
Well, thank you.
um
Thank
yeah,
you.
that's really cool. um
Thanks.
so it kind of segueing, I think, pain for me, the thing that I thought that the groups, when they joined Yona in the forest, for me, the connection between everybody, it seemed to be, was pain and loss. And the thing that I thought was so interesting was that these people kind of instantly trusted her. This strange woman in the forest, and there was never really a question of why. Like, I didn't question, like, well, this isn't believable, why would they trust her?
Right.
um it just was, it seems so authentic and natural. But if you think about it, or to me, I think it was the connection of that everybody had had pain and loss, and that was
Yeah.
the common factor for them that could bring them together, because obviously they're coming from civilization, whereas she's isolation, but they still could find common ground. And to me, that was the foundation for that, was the pain and the loss. Is that, would you kind of agree with that, or did you have other
Um,
thoughts about how they trusted her? And
I think it was a matter of survival. I think to me it was a matter of survival at the beginning. I think that those who seemed to accepted her readily because they needed to, because they didn't have the tools they needed to survive, or they might have been able to find those tools, but they didn't have them at the moment. And she was offering them something they couldn't offer themselves at that moment in time, which was, here's how to feed yourself, here's how to shelter, here's how to erase traces of yourself. And in offering them those things they needed, um, I think there was immediately a trust established, because she clearly didn't have anything but pure intentions. And it was difficult for her to step into their worlds and to do that. And I think when those things became obvious, there was no choice but to trust her. But I also think that one of the things that was interesting in looking into the real stories of life in the forest was that like the thing you had to do first when you got there, when you found your way into the wilderness, the thing that was first and foremost was you had to live. You had to live. You had to figure out how you were going to survive out there. How were you going to eat? How were you going to hide? Um, how are you going to stay warm? How are, all of these basic human survival needs. And those were things that you achieved in any way you could. So here's this woman delivering those things on a silver platter, and they really had no choice but to take them. I think the questions came later. The questions about who are you? Do you belong with us? Why are you here? Those sort of things. And those came, I think, from a very human place, because one of the things that to me is very interesting about writing historical fiction is that we expect that these people facing these horrendous insurmountable obstacles are so different than us, and their entire we assume that their whole journeys are going to be dictated by this tremendous thing they're facing. But I think at the end of the day, once you get those basic survival needs out of the way, people are people. We're going to
Right.
hurt, we're going to help, we're going to ache, we're going to love, we're going to grieve, like all of those emotions that there's no room for when you're just trying to survive come flooding back in. And then we relate to each other in a way very much like we relate to each other, here in 2021 in a very different situation, because humans are humans everywhere.
What was your thought about is it Shama? Someone just asked it. I think someone just asked this question too in the chat. But I mean, that the mom that was really reluctant.
Yeah.
Yeah, reluctant to trust her. Was that just because you're like, well, not everybody can? Was that just trying to create some conflict, or did you have
No,
more of a
that was very common. I mean, that the idea of in these big refugee societies that disappeared into the woods, there was that element to it. So and so sleeping with somebody, and I thought he was with me, and now he's with her, and there was that again. People being people once the basic survival needs are met. And so, in the instance of Hannah's family, with the mother and the father, and the mother, you know, feels feels erroneously, because Yona doesn't know what she's doing, feels that Yona is, flirting with her husband. And so she has this reaction to Yona and the husband, and reacts defensively and says, well, you don't belong here. We're a family. You're not in it. That's because she thinks her survival need has been achieved. Now they feel like they know how to survive. And okay, we're okay now. We don't need you anymore. And she reverts back to those basic human things, which in her case,
jealousy?
I assume she'd been betrayed before, or felt that the husband had been unfaithful before, and reacts with a very human reaction of jealousy to that. So she forgets that survival is sort of there. She's taking survival for granted, and she reverts back to what's in her heart, and what she's scared of.
Yep. That makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
So let's see. Anissa just asked, what was the most difficult scene to write and why?
The most difficult scene to write. That's a good question, Anissa. The final scene of the book, not the final, but the final scene where there's a
Mm-hmm.
not where we kind of get a glimpse of what happens after the war, but the final scene in the timeline that we're with, and I don't want to give anything away, of action. It's an action scene.
Yes.
And that was difficult to write because it was emotional, and because a lot had to take place in that scene, but it couldn't be too talky, because you're not going to give a long monologue. I don't want to give anything away, but like it's a
Right.
very it's a moment of very heightened danger. um and you're not going to give like a 2-page monologue about here's what I found in the forest, and this is where I've been, and this is who I am now, and like
Yeah.
that's not going to happen. But I had to convey some of those discoveries and points of awareness. Plus there was just emotional stuff I was dealing with, so that was emotional, and hard to write. And maybe there was a scene when she's in town, in a town, and discovers some people dead. That was difficult to write too.
Yeah.
Oh, and also, oh, there's another scene in the forest. I can't say without giving stuff away. Every time I had to kill somebody off, I'll just say that was difficult.
Yeah. Oh, somebody's asking a question we're going to end with, so you can't answer that one yet. But okay. Oh, yeah. Um, so Jennifer, my partner in crime, said she didn't see Yona's mother's identity coming,
Ooh,
and
yeah.
I didn't either. That threw me for a loop as well.
That was really important to me. I knew that was going to be um, a piece of it. But I also wanted it to be a piece that didn't really change who Yona was,
Right.
because the whole thing was a search for identity. And just like the answer that I've kind of come to in my own life is like, yes, these things I've learned about my past and about my family change a little bit, but they don't change who I am at my core. You know what I mean? They change the journey that I know my ancestors have been on. They change, maybe they change slightly my relationship to the world, but they don't change who I am at my core. And I thought that was an important answer I've come to in my own journey. And it was interesting to kind of give Yona a similar round trip. If that makes sense.
Yeah. So your publicist is asking a question. This makes me laugh. She wants to know, did you know from the beginning about, I'm assuming she means about her mom, or did that come up during the writing process? Was that part of your plan?
It did come up during the writing process, but it came up early in the writing process. So it was I and once I was like, yeah, that's what has to happen. I was like, of course. And like everything else kind of fell into place, which sometimes happens. It's like you have a feeling where your story is going and where it needs to go and like the questions you're asking. But then that one final piece slots into place and you're like, aha. And like everything, the kind of the why of it, the whole circle of what you're doing becomes complete, if that makes sense. So that was a little bit of that for me.
Totally. So probably a good segue into her husband, Yona's father. So would you say Jutner? Is that how I would pronounce that name?
Utner.
Utner.
Yep,
Utner.
Utner.
Okay.
Yeah.
So not German.
Well, you know what? I had to have a German translator. I hired a German translator to help me with the pronunciations so that I could record them and give them to the audiobook narrator because they want to make sure they get everything correct too. And so yes, I always thought it was Jutner. It is Utner is the correct way to say it, but I'm so insecure about my German pronunciations that when I read a passage of this book, there's a street name in the passage I normally read, and I don't say it. I just say the apartment because I just don't think I'm going to execute it correctly. And I'm so nervous. I'm going to say it in a way that does a disservice to it that I just don't say it at all when I read it out
Yeah.
loud. So I understand.
German is for me a daunting language.
It is. It's a very difficult language. Yeah.
All right. So Utner embodies the Nazi regime, but at the same time, he certainly suffered incredible loss and heartache. I mean, he lost his daughter when she was 2, and then, his wife not long after.
Yeah.
So can you talk about Yona, their interaction? And, clearly it's a turning point for her. But it's tied to, I think, loneliness for both of them. And ultimately, was his loneliness and sense of hopelessness what put him in the ultimate mindset of a Nazi? Or do you think he always was?
Well, so that's a great question. So in chapter 1, we know already he's a Nazi, right? So chapter 1, we we see that Yona is actually conceived the night that he goes to see Hitler speak and comes back so enthused about Hitler that he wakes his wife up and sleeps with her, and that's when Yona's conceived, right? So like he's a Nazi from the beginning. But a lot of people followed those sentiments as early as 1920 as he did, and then didn't remain ardent followers as
Right.
the party deepened as the party became something different, that it wasn't, I mean, I guess it always kind of was, but it became different things as it evolved. It was not uncommon though in 1920, right after World War I, when Germany was in complete economic ruin, for people to be drawn to the magnetism of a group like that, that was saying, you know, the things that have happened are somebody else's fault and they're not your fault, and Germany is great and we just have to restore, you know, it's sort of all, it was very tantalizing, and you can see how people came to that in the rubble and ruin after World War I, right? So here's my question about the father though. Would he have stayed along that path if Yona wasn't taken? Because this was this horrible, tragic thing that
Right.
happened in his life. And then, you know, it it changed everything for him. So was that a blip on the screen of what was always going to happen? Or was that the turning point that changed him, that turned him into something that there was no coming back from? So that piece of his character was really interesting to me, as well as this idea that when Yona, when he does have an interaction with Yona later in the novel, um, how much of him wants to be her father
Mm,
versus how much of him wants to do these things that he's now promised to do and he's now committed to do. I mean, you can't just, if you're a Nazi officer, you can't just say, you know what, I changed my mind. I think I'm gonna head home. Everything's good. You know, I'm done. I'm done doing Nazi things. I'm out. Like, that's just not really how it works. So, like, you know
right.
what I mean? So the pieces of, he was a really interesting character to me, because I again, just like with Yerusha, I can't answer that question. Would he always have been who he became, or did she shift his life by shifting Yona's life? You know?
Yeah. Well, and then ultimately, his wife, yeah. I mean,
Yep.
she definitely, yeah,
Yep.
whole thing. And is his loneliness, um, what, did he find, I don't know, camaraderie, or, I don't know what the appropriate word would be, a sense of belonging by, his role, in the Nazi organization. And is that, um, something that, I hate to use the word saved him, because it's not the, but,
Well,
is that what he was drawn
yeah.
to, and,
I
kept him going?
and I think so. But then if those things hadn't happened to him, would he always have done that and found a
Right.
calling in that and found solace in that, you know? So it's, I think this is one of those ultimate what came first, the chicken or the egg scenarios, you know? Like, I don't know. I'm not really sure about him. But certainly in the novel, he turns out to be someone who does have a heart, but in the end, is that the side of himself that he follows, you know?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So to me, another big kind of theme or conflict within the novel is, man versus man, or
Hmm.
man versus nature. And I'm assuming that was intentional, obviously.
Yeah.
And ultimately, which do you think was the bigger challenge, for the characters in the book? Was it nature, or was it man?
I think they were both enormous challenges, because if you couldn't survive in the forest, it didn't matter what the man versus man didn't matter if you couldn't find a way to sustain yourself. But I think, as was the case in reality, once people found their way into the forest, once people found their way to groups that could help them to survive, then that man versus man conflict became more powerful and more at the forefront. So, and I think in the book, as in real life, that unfolded on many levels. It was the German soldiers versus the refugees in the forest. It was the villagers around the forest who would have gladly turned them in versus the refugees in the forest who were going on food missions and raiding the guns and raiding the food and raiding the clothing from villagers' houses. And it was man versus man in these groups, just like it is every day around us. You know what I mean? Like those little interpersonal conflicts that unfold once we meet our basic survival needs. So I think there are a lot of levels of man versus man, and man versus himself too. But in answer to whether the people versus the forest against the people versus the Germans. I think the people versus the Germans was the harder threat.
Yeah, yeah. But it's so interesting how you went back and forth, right?
Yeah.
Because just, or you interwove them, right? So
Yeah.
just where they would kind of be getting comfortable, up, it's time to move, and
Yeah.
um oh gosh, we got to get to an island that's through a swamp. But you know what I
Yes.
mean?
Well,
It's
you,
like,
you know though, like I think just I'm just thinking now as you're asking this though, I feel like the difference between the two sets of challenges is one is out to get you and one just is. You know what I mean?
mhm,
And the one that just is presents an enormous amount of challenges, but it's challenges that if you have the know-how, you can confront them. Whereas when people are hunting you, actual people hunting other humans, that's such an unpredictable and unfair and unweighted element of
mm,
I don't know of just I mean, how do you survive against that? The fact that they did was extraordinary. The fact that in real life they did, the fact that in that group the group that was kind of the most well-known group in that area, the Bielski partisans, the fact that almost all of them survived and that by the end of the war they numbered 1,200 people, like that's extraordinary. How did they
right.
survive all of that? I mean, it's absolutely amazing. So and ultimately they survived man versus man and man versus nature, and you had to do both, you had to survive both, right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
um Harbor just asked, did you have a chance to visit the woods that you wrote about in Poland?
Well, wouldn't that have been nice? But the challenge of writing this book that you pitch in January of 2020, sell in February of 2020, and begin writing in March of 2020
It's
is
the
that
pandemic.
it is not a great time to write about a forest you've never been to. I will say that that I would not have been able to finish this book if not for connecting with a man named Vadim Sidorovich, who has written an academic book. He has a PhD. He's written an academic book about the flora, fauna, and human history of the forest, of the primary forest I'm writing about, the Nalabaka or the Nalabaki forest. So he's written a wonderful, comprehensive book about it. But there were a lot of things that I was not able to find in the book, a lot of things very specific to the 1940s, very specific to my story, very specific to certain areas of the forest that just those answers were not in that book or in any books I could find. And so I reached out to him and we connected, and I explained what I was doing. And we set up an arrangement where I paid him by the hour and he answered everything I sent him. I would send him 20 questions at a time. And they weren't the big questions. They weren't, how do you get from this point to this point? They were, when you're in this area of the forest and um, you've been shot and the bullets through and through, but you need something to stop the bleeding. Would you use this herb, which I found in a book about herbal medicine? And
Yeah.
he'd say, no, that herb grows just in the northern part of the forest, but right now you're in the southeastern part of the forest. And so this is an herb that you might consider, but you might want to make it into a paste by doing such and such. I mean, it was like the most detailed answers. You know, it's this month in the forest and um, they're
You're not
starving.
gonna find.
I
Yeah.
mean, it's amazing. It was every little thing. I asked him how the refugees made mud bricks because I was so fascinated by. I couldn't really wrap my head around what they built these shelters into the ground called zemlyankas, and they were how they survived the winter. But the shelters had stoves with chimneys
Right.
to keep them warm and to cook food, and you would need that to survive too. You couldn't just sit underground and hope to live. But I didn't understand the mechanics of that. How did they build a stove? How did they build chimneys? They had nothing. They didn't go into town and ask for like a bricklayer to come and help them, right? So I'm like, I don't understand how that worked. And so he taught me all about how to make mud bricks, told me like step by step, this is how you make a brick out of mud, but mud made from the dirt in that specific part of the forest. And then he would go so far as to go out into the forest and find old mud brick molds from the 1940s and send me pictures of the mud brick molds and send me pictures of himself demonstrating how to use. I mean, it was just like everything I needed to know. He gave me like everything I asked for and more. And that is what ultimately brought the forest alive for me. It was extraordinary. It was extraordinary that I was able to connect with him and extraordinary that he was so helpful.
Okay, because that just basically answered my next question, because I was like, how did you know about all of like the intricacies of the forest
Well,
and survival, and like
so
I'm like, are you a
no,
Girl
you
Scout, or do you
no,
watch
I
Naked
was
and
I
Afraid?
was
It's
literally
like,
never even a Girl Scout. Like I mean I was more ill prepared than any one of these refugees to stumble into this forest, right? I did start with a ton of research reading before I realized I was going to find this person to connect with. Because there were a lot of things that he wouldn't have been an expert at answering. For instance, Yona needed to learn how to kill someone with her bare hands. She needed to know a lot
right.
of ways to do that because that was something that Yerusha, the woman who took her, would have taught her, thinking that her life was going to be in danger all the time. So
Mhm.
I have books, I can see them right now, books piled on my desk that are about like self-defense without weapons. So I did books worth of reading about how to kill a person using just your hands or using what's lying around. So like I know more about that than I ever should. Um, I have wilderness survival guides like stacked the height of my desk. So like those were all things I read before I talked to him. But what I needed from him was I had all these ideas about wilderness survival and all these manuals to wilderness survival, but not all of them applied to his forest, to that specific forest, because there might be a mention of tree bark, a particular tree bark that does a certain thing, and like so of course that would be the tree bark to put in this scene. But then I'd ask him and he'd say, well, that tree doesn't grow in this part of the forest, you know what I mean? So I took this vast quantity of details. And then he was able to help me narrow that research down and figure out what I knew that fit and what I knew that didn't fit. Does that make sense?
Mhm. Totally.
Yeah.
It's fascinating. And he was probably so excited to have kind of something, maybe, I don't know, maybe something to do during the pandemic
You
that
know,
gave
I
him
I I
purpose.
I don't know. He was just so kind to help me though. I mean, he felt like a gift from God, honestly. Like I mean, what are the odds that I found someone so helpful who could speak English? He lives in Belarus and he spoke great English. I mean, what are the odds though that I found this guy that was exactly what I needed at the time that uh, really, unfortunately, I couldn't physically travel there. I mean, he took me there through all of his pictures and his words and his descriptions and his answers. I mean, it was phenomenal.
Well, and even if you had traveled there, I mean, would you
Yeah.
have gotten that
No,
knowledge? I mean,
no,
yeah.
no. And unless I had been lucky enough to stumble across him there myself. But I honestly think that if I had gone there, I might have made more assumptions than I should have about, there would have been a wrong herb here or a wrong tree there. Because I would have just thought, well, I've been there. And yes, of course I saw that herb in the forest, but I might not have stopped to say 3 miles away, that herb might not grow. Or in this part, you know what I mean? So those were the nuances that he knew that I don't think I would have been able to figure out on my own. I know I wouldn't have been able to figure out them out on my own.
Um, do you have time? I think we had said 30 to
Oh
45
yeah,
minutes, and we're
this
are
is
you
fine.
okay?
Sure,
Okay.
sure.
All right,
Yeah,
awesome. I just want to keep
yeah,
you.
yeah. Of course, no.
I have a couple more questions. So I've been asking this question lately because we have a lot of budding writers apparently in our book club,
Great.
and so it's kind of become an interesting question to ask as well, because I know you have a young child. So
Yeah.
how do you juggle writing with children? And secondly, what are 5 things maybe you wish you knew when you started writing that you could tell people now, or what are
Okay.
your tips?
Okay. Those are great questions. Okay. So first of all, how I juggle writing. Well, writing is much easier when you don't have a 5-year-old home in a pandemic, where you have to make up a curriculum to teach him his VPK because there's no virtual option for him. That really throws a wrench in the workday. But on a normal basis, I get my writing done when he's in school. Um, he was always in preschool prior to the pandemic. But I will tell you that I wrote my first 6 novels while working full time for a magazine. And one tip I like to give writers who are just starting out who think they don't have enough hours in the day is just like you carve time out for a workout when there aren't enough hours in the day, you got to carve out an hour to write. Or, I mean, I would say an hour is a good beginning goal if you have a very busy life and you have a job and you have family obligations. I wrote my first novel working full time. I did not have a child at that point, so that did make things a little bit easier probably. But I just set my alarm an hour before I would ordinarily wake up for work. I rolled out of bed. I had my automatic coffee maker already brewing my coffee. I didn't brush my teeth. I didn't pass go. I didn't do anything. I just rolled out of bed, poured my cup of coffee. I mean, I'm sure I probably went to the bathroom, but poured my cup of coffee, sat down at my computer, and wrote for an hour until my next alarm went off. That was like the real alarm to start my day. And if I did that 5 days a week, I was always touching the story. And when I wasn't actually working on it, the story was always bubbling in the back of my head. So the next morning, when I sat down to write for an hour, I didn't have to spend 30 or 45 minutes catching up and thinking, where was I yesterday? What was I thinking? Because it was always with me. So to me, try to touch your story every other day. It's fine to take a break here and there. If you write 5 days a week instead of 7, that's fine. Um, but try to touch the story every day if you can, or every other day with a couple of exceptions. Um, so that's kind of my biggest suggestion about juggling. As far as things that I wish I had known at the beginning, let me think. Outlining is your friend. I think a lot of writers don't outline, but I think if you're writing a first novel and you're struggling with finding your way into it, writing an outline gives you both a roadmap, which kind of staves off writer's block, and it also gives you like a safety net, like a security blanket. So I think it's easier to move forward. Like it's easy to get trapped a third of the way in or a half of the way in where you're like, oh, I don't really know where I'm going, and this isn't very good, and I can't see my way out of this scene. I can't see where I'm going with this book. But if you have an outline, you're not going to get stuck in it. You're not going to get mired in it. So I would say write an outline, touch your book every day or every other day if you can. Don't worry if you're doing it in small doses, even if you're writing 250 words a day, which is like a page. Those pages are going to add up. If you do that,
Hmm.
if you write 4 days a week, that's 1,000 words a week. And, you know, I don't know, 1,000 words a week, you'll have a book done in less than 2 years. If you can do 2,000 words a week, you'll have a book done in a year. Am I doing the math right? Yes. Cause like a book's about 100,000 words. Um, okay. Other tips. A lot of the writing world, being an author is about relationships, and I used to always assume that it would be very competitive, and that you're trying to beat each other out for spots on bestseller lists, and you're trying to beat each other out for sales. It's not like that at all. It doesn't feel like that. It's about supporting each other. We're all in this journey together. Mary Kay Andrews is a good friend of mine, and she's always saying, and I know obviously it's not her original quote, but she says it all the time: a rising tide lifts all boats. And it does. And I think those of us who are doing this right, um, do it that way. Ellen Hildebrand was the one who put me in touch with you, Jennifer.
Hmm.
And
Yep.
that was a kindness she didn't have to pay forward, but she did, because she's kind. And those of us, I think, who are doing this business right, as obviously she's doing it right, do it with kindness, and do it with an attitude about paying it forward, and do it with an attitude of support. So I would say, if you're at the beginning of your writing journey, don't be afraid to ask for help. Don't be afraid to find your community. Don't be afraid to work with other writers and ask for feedback from other writers. I mean, writers who are ahead of you in the journey, but also writers who are in the same place as you, because it's all about community. And the earlier you start building it, I think the better off you'll be. I'm trying to think if there are any other smart tips. I don't know. I'll tell you if I come up with any others, but those are probably the main the main ones that are occurring
Yeah.
to me right
So
now.
those were all awesome ones. And yeah, I do like to sometimes fill people in, how we got connected. But yes, Ellen was very helpful and instrumental in introducing us. And um, I would say that that's been a resounding theme with all the authors kind of that
Yeah.
I've been talking with this year. Um, it is a group of people that everybody, it doesn't seem competitive to me at all, and
It's
everybody
not.
kind of wants to help each other. And as a whole, I think people
Yep.
are just so happy to have authors, are so happy to have people reading. And
Yes. Yep.
they don't care what it is as long as you're reading. So
Yes.
I think that has been really heartwarming, I guess, for me to see, that there never seems to be competitiveness or
Yep.
dislike, or there's no negativity, it seems like, in this industry.
There's not. And I mean, we're all human, so of course you have those moments of feeling like, like that was something I wish I got, or things like that. But like, that's just being a human and a person. And I think we all still support each other and put our best foot forward and our best heart forward to support readers and writers and all of that. I think it's really important.
Awesome. So perfect ending to our discussion. We like to always ask what some of your favorite reads are right now, or what you've recently read that you love. But someone did also ask specifically to historical fiction, who your favorite historical fiction authors are. So I'll throw that in there in the mix
Okay,
as well.
those are great questions. I don't think I have favorite historical fiction authors because there's so many people doing it so well in so many different ways that I would basically just give you a list of every historical fiction author I've ever read, because everybody is doing something amazing that I admire, that I think, oh wow, like you did that really really well, or that's something to think about for my writing in the future. So I feel like I learn something every time I read somebody else's books, because there's just so many people doing beautiful work. I will say some books I've read recently that are historical fiction that I have loved that I would recommend are, I just earlier tonight had a Zoom with a wonderful author named Sadiqa Johnson, Johnson, right? Oh my God, I'm like having a brain freeze. She wrote Yellow Wife,
Mm.
which was a phenomenal book. It came out, I think, earlier this year. It's incredible. It's the story of an enslaved woman who thinks she's going to be granted her freedom, and instead she winds up in this notorious jail in Richmond. So it's just an amazing book that I think everybody should read, and it's so well written. So that one's called Yellow Wife. Um, there is there's one that came out recently by Kelly Rimmer called The Warsaw Orphan, which was incredible. I love Kelly Rimmer. She is just the funniest, most delightful Australian human being you've ever met. But she's also an incredible historical fiction writer. This is a book set in World War II and post World War II Poland. It's very good. The Women of Chateau Lafayette by Stephanie Dray was another one I read this year that I really like, and I think was um, probably deserved to be much huger than it was, because it was such a sweeping, enormously well researched book. It's about three women across three generations: the French Revolution, World War I, and World War II, all associated with the Chateau Lafayette in France. So that was very good. Coming up, the three I wanted to mention were three books by three of my four fellow Friends in Fiction writers. So I have a group called Friends in Fiction, which, if you don't know, we're a book group. We're live on Facebook every Wednesday night at 7 p.m. Eastern. We're also on YouTube, but it's a place to connect with other readers. And then in our live show, we interview other authors. And so it's me, Mary Kay Andrews, Patty Callahan Henry, Christy Woodson Harvey, and Mary Alice Monroe. And the first three I named, Mary Kay Andrews, Patty Callahan Henry, and Christy Woodson Harvey, all have winter books coming out this fall. So,
Oh,
so one of them is The Santa Suit by Mary Kay Andrews, which comes out in September. And then Patty Callahan she's writing it under Patty Callahan. Her book, Once Upon a Wardrobe, which is so good. It's the story of how C.S. Lewis came up with Narnia. So
oh,
it's such a cool book. That one comes out, I think, October 19th. And then Christy Woodson Harvey's Christmas in Peachtree Bluff, which is the fourth in her Peachtree Bluff series, that comes out, I think, October 26th. So those are all three great books. I've gotten a chance to read all three of them. And I promise those are going to be enjoyable holiday reads this year.
awesome. Awesome. Well, we just announced Stephanie will be joining us to chat in September about,
Oh, Stephanie Dray?
yes. Yeah.
Oh, I want to come. She's so
Yeah.
fascinating to listen to. She's great.
Oh, I'll send you the Zoom link for sure. We'd
Please,
love to have you.
great.
Yeah, for sure. And then Kelly, I mean, All the Things You Cannot Say is right up there as one of my all-time favorites. So
have you ever had her?
No. So
Okay, you have to. Okay, I have to put you in touch. She's fantastic.
Please.
You'll love
I know
her.
the time change is probably a challenge, but we'll make it work.
She's actually okay with it. I've done things with her in the evening before, and 8 would work perfectly for her, I think, because I think this would be 10 a.m. where she is.
Yeah.
It works out perfectly though. It's like it's her morning. So
Oh,
yes,
perfect.
absolutely, she could do it. Yep.
Okay. Yeah, I have that book. I haven't read it yet because well, I have to read. Next up, we have the Great Circle's coming up. So that's a, I'm like, I gotta get going here.
Awesome. Yeah, wow.
I wish this was my full-time job and all I had to do was read. But
Yeah, hey, same with me. You mean I have to write the books too? I can't just read them? I know. So unfair.
Exactly. All right. So before I leave you, we'd like to know what you're working on. And I have to ask the question because the way you ended this book left me thinking that there might be an opportunity for a follow-up story. Is that in the works?
No,
Maybe?
I don't think so. I'm not
No?
much of a
Okay.
sequel writer. I kind of feel like the way I write sort of brings the stories full circle, and kind of completes their arc, their journey. So no, there probably won't be a sequel to this book. And I also think I explored what I needed to explore. And I don't really, I'd never say never to anything, but I don't see myself going back to that area of the world to write for a while, if ever. So I'm returning to the comfortable embrace of France, which I'm very comfortable there. I've written a lot of books in France. Um, and the next one I'm writing is another World War II, also in France. And it is about two mothers, two daughters, um, an Allied bomb that drops where it shouldn't, um, a city block that's destroyed along with the families that resided there, and then a storyline in 1960 New York that puts all the pieces of that past together.
Oh.
So, yeah, that's
People are
about.
already like, that sounds so good.
Thank you. I hope I can execute it. It's due November 1st, so I'm working on it.
Oh, so when sign me up. Everyone's like, sign me up. So when are you hoping to release that? Next spring?
It'll probably be next July. So that seems to be my publishing month now. So hopefully July 2022. That's the plan.
Okay, well,
Yeah.
hopefully we would love to have you back to chat
Yay,
chat about that. And
I would love that. That'd be so much
thank
fun.
you so much. This was so fun. And
Thanks
we
for having
record
me.
this, so we will share not only the recording, and we'll continue to recommend this book in the group constantly.
Thank
And
you.
of course, the Book of Lost Names, as well as my personal, whenever
Thank
anybody
you.
asks me. But we'll also now share some of your book recommendations as well. So to help
Great.
promote those, yeah, and we'll put those up in
Perfect.
the
If
group.
you need me to send you the list so you don't have to go back through and listen, I can do that if that's easier.
My partner in crime was on, and she does
Perfect.
all that.
Oh,
So it's
okay.
awesome.
I see what you're saying. I got it. Perfect. Great.
So thank you so much. Have a great night, and it's been a
Thank
pleasure.
you.
And I'll send you an email. Maybe you can connect me with Kelly. That would be
I
fantastic.
would be happy to. You will love her so much. She's awesome.
Awesome. Thank you. Have a
Thank you
great
so much
night.
for having me. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.